My name is Clive Rosen. I'm a lecturer here at the University of Derby in computing, and I'm also the coordinator for final year projects and also for postgraduate master's projects at the university. I supervise final year projects and master's projects as well. I'm also the computing coordinator for the BSc with World Education Council in Malaysia and Singapore. So as a consequence of that, I help to ensure that the projects are moderated and the marking is of the appropriate standard. I have other responsibilities for other collaborations around the world as well. As a supervisor of student projects here at Derby, I think the biggest problem that students have is actually deciding what they actually want to study and what they're going to do as their final year project. It's really a problem of working out an appropriate scope which is sufficiently challenging for them, and at the same time they can get access to the data that they need to do the research, and also that they aren't taking on too much. A lot of students seem to want to try and do a PhD project in about 9 months without having the necessary research skills. And as a supervisor, you have to say, that sounds like a really good idea, but you have to try and reduce the scope of what they do so that it's actually feasible within the time period. A lot of students don't really have an idea of what is expected of them, what they want to do and what they should be allowed to do. And here at Derby we try and encourage students to study something that they're really interested in, that is something that will help them with their future careers, but is something that they want to know about. You have to have a question, you have to have something that you can answer within the period of time. So identifying a question is not quite as easy as it seems, because quite often students come to you with a topic rather than with a particular question that they want to answer in that topic. So they might want to study, say, I don't know, let's say e-commerce, for example, which is fine, okay, but how do you actually, what aspect of e-commerce do you want to study? How do you want to study it? What is it that particularly interests you? So they might say, well, it's to do with maybe the security. You know, how do you have an e-commerce system that is also secure? And then you develop it, and you have to refine the question so that it's a question that actually you can collect data in. A lot of students, for example, on the security side of things, will have problems actually accessing the data. So they might want to study, say, something like problems with banking systems, security systems in banking. Well, there's no way they can do that because they just cannot get at the data. Banks won't give them the data. But there are a whole range of projects, and it's very difficult to nail it down to something that is very specific. So, for example, students might want to do some sort of experiment, for example. So they might, in computing particularly, they might want to write a program, and that's fine. There's no problem with actually writing a program, but they also have to be able to evaluate that program against certain criteria. And if they don't have the criteria and they don't know what criteria they're going to measure against, then they don't actually have a project. So you can write a program, but what is that program trying to do, and how effective, how successful is it to do that? And a lot of students don't seem to understand that they really need to be able to evaluate their own work, and that's a really important point that they need to actually come to terms with at the beginning. They need to focus on that, and because one of the problems I think is that without having a very clear focus, students wander off in all sorts of different directions and don't actually stick to a particular topic, so they end up with nothing in effect that can actually be assessed, and that's a real problem. So I suppose I've picked up about 3 or 4 things there, but the main one is actually deciding, getting it clear at the beginning what your objectives are, what you want to study, how you're going to study it, and what methodology, and therefore from that the methodology follows. But working out exactly what you want to do is the important thing. In my role moderating for the work that WEC students do on their final year projects, I think that a lot of the problems I see are similar, but I think that more WEC students are in work and actually try and do a project that is related to the work that they're doing, and that's fine. That's actually, they have more opportunity in that sense for studying something interesting, and a lot of the students are actually are working in technologies and using new technologies. But what they don't seem to appreciate is that it's not just a case of doing something. It's not just a case of working on a project. It's different. The work that you do on a project when you're actually in work is different from what we're expecting in academia at the university. You have to have some academic content there. So you're not just reporting that you produced a new piece of software or that you implemented a database. You have to look at something like maybe what the issues were or what the problems were with implementing that database. What is it that's different about that database from other databases? You have to be able to compare what you have done with perhaps what other people have done. You have to look at the research literature and understand how the research literature can inform what you're doing. So you have to look at that literature and say, well, the literature says that you should do it this way. In my firm, we did it this way, and as a consequence, this was either better or this was worse. So there you've got the evaluation of what you've done, and you've got the comparison with the academic theory. And I think particularly in computing, which doesn't have a huge amount of theoretical concepts and ideas, students sometimes think that it's just a matter of doing something. And actually, there's quite a lot of literature that you need to look at. Now, some of that literature is obvious, and in computing in particular, some of that literature is in the form of white papers, for example. It's available on Google. It's available, and you can download it very quickly and very easily. But a lot of it doesn't have much academic credibility. So you have to be able to evaluate the credibility and the value of the literature before you can say that that you're doing this or you're doing that, and then work out whether or not that the literature has been useful or valuable, whether you found that the literature is correct or, in your case, incorrect. Now, I probably used the wrong term there when I say correct or incorrect. It's more likely to be what the limitations of the theory or the concept or the literature is, and whether or not it applies in your particular case. So I think that in computing in particular, you're often using much more of a case study, and I think World Education Council students, because they're in work, are using case study, and they're only using a single case study, and that's a problem because you really need to be able to compare and contrast with other situations, other contexts, and you can either get those contacts from literature or you can do it by comparing and contrasting what you're doing in one particular context with another context, one project with another project, one company with another company, that sort of thing. And we don't, the work I have seen from students in Singapore and Malaysia, they don't often do that, and they don't get this what I would say is a benchmark to compare and contrast with. So and that limits their ability to be able to demonstrate their ability to critically evaluate what other people have done and also what they are doing, because unless you've got something to compare against, then critical evaluation is a problem. So if the students aren't able to demonstrate critical evaluation, then what happens is that they can't achieve the learning outcomes, which are what we call the level 6 learning outcomes, the final year of a degree learning outcomes. So, and that's why if there is a case for marking down students or moderating the work down from what has been suggested by their supervisor, for example, it's probably because of that. It's probably because they maybe have the capability of being critical and evaluating the work they've done, but they haven't actually demonstrated it in their report. And that's where the main problem lies, I think. If I were to give advice to students, and I have to say that generally speaking, I'm reluctant to give advice to anybody and to students in particular, it would be to start thinking about the project a long time before you actually start that project. So, I mean, and that's easier for Derby students because they're doing 3 or 4 years at the university, and in computing they have the placement year before they actually start the final year. So we can tell the students start thinking about the project that they want to do in their final year, and they have 6 months before they actually start it. And you can start doing some research, and you can look into what people have already done in that particular field. And talk to supervisors or potential supervisors, talk to people in industry if you've got that opportunity about what the problems are, what problems that the people actually face, and how can you actually, and think about how you can actually study them. Look for the literature that's available, do some research before you actually start, and think about, is this something that I really want to do? Is this something I'm really interested in knowing about? Or is it something that somebody has suggested to me might be a good idea? It's difficult for Malaysian students and Singapore students to realise how cold, wet and damp it gets in Britain in January and February. And students here have to work through the very short days and long dark nights here, and they have to get their work done and they have to carry on working. And it's more difficult at that time of year, January and February in the UK. Fortunately, in Malaysia and Singapore, you don't have that particular problem, but you've probably got other problems and other distractions. And if you're working, then you may have work that takes you away from what you're actually doing. So, for your University of Derby work. So, you have to have something that you want to do, that you want to know about, that interests you, that enthuses you, that is going to, you're going to, in a sense, always be dissatisfied with the result that you get. That there's always going to be some other question that you haven't answered, that you would like to look into. And if you finish a project, any sort of project, and you feel like that, then that's great, because it means you've really got into it and you've understood what's going on. Trying to work out what that might be at the beginning is the hard part, really, and the more thought you give to it, and the more you think about what you really want and what you're interested in, I think that the better it is for you to actually, it will be for you for in terms of the project. So you will do a better job. And if obviously the more involved you get in the project and the more work you put into it, the better grade you get, which is at the end of the day what you really want. So yeah, I think if there was a particular piece of advice, it would be do something that you are really, really interested in doing.